Hi, this is Mike Gant, and this is episode 20 of Bible Mechanics. And today I want to talk with you about Bible translations. Last time I was, breaking down the Bible and pointing out that the Old Testament comes from ancient Jews, the New Testament comes from ancient Christians. But how does it get in the form where we receive it today, where we get to read it in English? And so that's what this episode is all about. So the ancient Jews spoke Hebrew, and so the Old Testament originally was recorded in the Hebrew language. By the time that would have been, say, roughly 1500 BC to roughly 400 or 500 BC. By the time about 200 BC, the Jews translated their scriptures into Greek. Greek was the lingua franca of the known world at that time. And Alexander the Great had conquered great territory, and Greek culture, including its language, had dominated throughout the Mediterranean world. So the Jews, many of them were dispersed because in 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel had been conquered by Assyria, and its people, scattered to the four winds. It was called the diaspora. And Jews were scattered all over the world because they were driven from the land. And then the southern kingdom, Judea, was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. And they were dispersed. Now, they were regathered about 70 years later. Many of them came back, many of them didn't. But the point of all this is that there were Jews living all throughout the world. Whereas, when God called Abraham, and then Isaac, and then Jacob, and then ultimately when the descendants grew so much, he used Moses to form a nation. And you'll recall that he took over the land of Canaan through them and for them. But they didn't hold the land. And so in 722 BC, 586 BC, many Jews were driven from the land and never returned around the world. Well, they ceased to learn how to read Hebrew because they were growing up in these foreign cultures. So the Jews wanted to translate a Bible into Greek, which they did. And they just had the Old Testament at the time, and it was called the Septuagint. And then when the New Testament came along, the Greeks are still dispersed. There's still some living in the Holy Land. The rest of them were dispersed. But from from early on, not from the very beginning, but from fairly early in the Christian movement, at least about 8 to 10 years after Jesus was raised from the dead, Gentiles were brought in. So it was a faith that was intended for the world, and it made sense for it to be in Greek. Now, when Constantine, the Roman emperor, became a Christian in the early 4th century, that started a move to translate the Bible into Latin, and a man named Jerome did that. I forget when it happened, somewhere like, I think, late in the 4th century, maybe even early in the 5th century. And then it would be variously translated, but it mainly stayed in Latin. Then in the 14th century, it was for the first time translated into English by a man named John Wycliffe. He was translating it from Latin or translating the New Testament at least. I can't remember if he did the whole Bible or not. But he was at least translating the New Testament, translated it from the Latin into the English. But there was still a desire that it be translated from the original Greek, because that was Latin would be one language removed from the original language of the New Testament. So in the 16th century, a man named William Tyndale translated it into English, gave his life for the cause, was eventually killed at the stake for his work, preaching Christ and translating the Bible into English. He wanted a plowboy to be able to read the Bible as well as a bishop or cardinal or whoever. And then, famously, the King James Bible was published in the 17th century. The year was 1611. And that served our ancestors in colonial America and, throughout the entire period of colonial America, from the time that they landed at Jamestown in Virginia and at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts. I think it was 1620 at Plymouth. And they used that. And the British revised the version finally in the late 1800s. And then an American version was translated in 1901. It's called the American Standard Version because Americans speak a different kind of English from the British folks. And that, if you sort of fast forward to the current day, that has remained. Now, it was updated in 1960 by what's called the New American Standard Bible. And if you follow me at all, either on this YouTube channel or on my website, you see me quoting the New American Standard Bible, or NASB, it's usually called. Sometimes it's just abbreviated NAS, but more often it's abbreviated NASB. And that originally came out in 1960, as I said. Then they had a major revision in 1995, and then another one in 2020. Now, I still use the 1995 because the 2020 leans kind of woke. I don't have the exact details, but the people that produce it are trying to stay literal, and they made some choices in the 2020 edition, which they didn't break their commitment to be literal, but as I say, it just leans kind of woke a little bit. So it seems to me that the 1995 NASB is probably the most literal translation that's available in English. And literal is very important. These translations all exist on a spectrum of literal to paraphrase. Literal at one end of the spectrum, paraphrase at the other. And in the middle, they'll call them like readable or easy to read or something like that. So those are, those are the main ways. That's the main way that these English translations are distinguished from each other, is whether they're literal or paraphrase. Now, there's more that I could say, but I think that's enough time for this week, so we'll make this part 1, and next time will be part 2, and when we get to that, I'll talk to you in a little bit more detail about literal translations and why there's so many in America, and I'll look forward to you listening then and watching too. Bye.